All right, welcome. My name is Larry Oda. I'm past president of JCL, a board member, and Tim arranged this panel discussion. I think it's just more of a conversation. If you can't, I shouldn't say, you know, I don't know what I'm doing, but yeah, Sandy's laughing at me because he knows. But I'd like to introduce our panelists. The program has a short bio on each one of them. Tim Thomas, let me see, that's to your left, is an area historian, spent many years studying the marine, or the fishery. And he came across, in his studies, he found that the Japanese were really a driving force in the early days. So he'll be talking about the early days. Sandy Lydon, noted historian from Cabrillo College, professor emeritus of history, is with us. I mean, all four of these gentlemen are noted historians of the area. Jeff Dunn, an author, historian from Santa Cruz, has written a number of books, both of the history of the area, plus quite a expert on the Chinese in the area, as is Sandy, because I think our two communities are really connected. And then David Yamada, professor emeritus from MPC, former, you're going to have to help me, David, was with the Panetta Institute chief. I forgot my notes.
Little League baseball player.
Former Little League baseball player. And yeah, he's a Willie Mays fan. I think his email used to be Willie's
Number 24.
Number 24. So we'll start off today with Mr. Thomas, and I think we have about an hour, so maybe 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes each. And I don't have a timer. My watch doesn't work. Oh, I have a clock on the wall. That's good. Yeah, just so we'll just have a conversation about the video. You know, Tim is the one that discovered the petitions in a drawer, and maybe he'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. All of us appreciate it. I guess the one question I always get is, how did I get involved with JCL and why am I here? And I have been researching the history of the fisheries of Monterey for over 30 years. I was the historian curator of the old Monterey Maritime Museum for a number of years. And it was, fishing is really Monterey's maritime history. And that's what brought me here, was that Japanese story. Because there's a story that really, other than Mr. Lydon here, people didn't really tell it, and they didn't understand it when they did tell it. You know, and it's really an important story. I mean, all Monterey, we know of Monterey, we think of Monterey Petition, we all think of sardines, we all think of Sicilian fisheries, and of course the Sicilian fishery was the Sicilian fishery, but if it wasn't for those Japanese fishermen, there wouldn't have been a sardine fishery in Monterey. So they all kind of lead together. And so it's all very important. You know, and it was really started probably in 1896, 1897, a gentleman by the name of Noda, who immigrated to Monterey. He got a job working for the then land on the Southern Pacific Railroad.
Mike's off.
I know, it just kind of died on me.
Uh-oh. Here, hand him mine.
Part two, okay. So He immigrated to Monterey and got a job working for the landowner of the Pacific Railroad, the Pacific Improvement Company, who at that time owned thousands of acres of the Monterey Peninsula. And they had this kind of weird, quirky idea that they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise, right? Who would think such a thing, right? So Noda actually was working, he was like a labor contractor, and he supplied labor to clear land and that kind of thing. And he was also a supplier of foods and a supplier of woods. In fact, Larry Oda's grandfather worked with Mr. Noda at one time. And so Noda was working near the Monterey Wharf in one day, and he looked down into the harbor and he just saw this huge abundance of abalone. I mean, so much abalone, he literally described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone. And nobody was doing anything with it. And the reason nobody in Monterey at that time was doing anything with it because nobody knew. I mean, what the heck are you supposed to do with it? Well, unless you're preparing abalone properly, it is kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese were dealing with abalone for centuries. They knew exactly what to do with it. And so Noda writes a letter back to the government of Japan and said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends a gentleman here by the name of Jinosuke Kodani, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. He comes over and goes, oh, this is great. Not only is there a lot of abalone, these abalone are big. There are a wide variety of abalone. Right? Monterey has home to the red abalone, which is the largest of the abalone and the most predominant abalone in the Monterey Bay. So Kodani sends back to Japan for abalone divers, known as ama, or free divers. In between that time, Noda actually goes down to what's now present-day Cannery Row and leases a piece of property. If y'all know Cannery Row, there's a piece of property between the El Chorito restaurant and I believe the other restaurant, I can't remember the name of it, that's right under the end of it there, and a big empty property, and it's been in litigation a number of years now, and there's a group that wants to put a marketplace kind of thing in there now, and all kinds of different things. And he leased that piece of property, and he sent back to Japan for other Japanese fishermen, that there's salmon in Monterey Bay in particular. And salmon is key here. And these guys come over and they create a fishing colony on that site down there. And then these ama divers come, and I believe that they were first taken to Noda's camp on present-day Cannery Row. And they got dressed in traditional ama gear, which was just this little white cotton outfit. And if you have a chance to go down to our museum, you can see all of this, be a picture of all of this. And a white little cotton outfit and a pair of goggles which had pig's bladders on the end that they would squeeze to help release the pressure. And they got dressed, jumped into the Monterey Bay, and quickly learned that Monterey Bay is not like Japan. It's cold. And it's actually about a 15-degree water temperature difference between Monterey and Japan, which is a huge difference. And so around that same time, the Japanese were experimenting with the helmet gear. They sent for helmet divers, and they began to helmet dive in Monterey Bay, which was far more efficient, actually, than the ama divers. Although there were ama divers diving ama style in Monterey into the 1920s. And they would work in pairs on a boat, and the boat would have a barrel in the middle of it that had a constant fire going. And then the divers would trade off, and they would tie a rope around the waist of the diver that ran through a pulley system, and he'd go into the bay, into the water, and he'd usually follow the anchor line down, and they'd go down 30, 40 feet. Keep in mind, there's no air supply here, so they're holding their breath. Some of these guys can hold their breath up to 3 minutes. And then when he's ready to go to the surface, his partner on the other end would take the other end of that rope, which had a weight attached to it, usually just a big rock. You toss it over the side, that would pull that diver straight up to the surface, and they would switch, and the other guy would go in and dive. But again, the helmet diving was far more efficient. But as I mentioned, Noda actually also sent a group of salmon fishermen. And salmon is king. Salmon was the big fishery in Monterey. and they lived in California really between 1895 and 1915. It was huge fishery. At that time, most of the salmon fishery in California was up along the Sacramento River. In the 1890s, they weren't getting a lot of salmon up there. There was a depression going on in this country. And so all the salmon processors formed this co-op called the Sacramento River Packers Association. When the Japanese arrived here and began to fish salmon, they brought new technology with them in the form of trolling lines, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in that bay out there. And they began to make large landings out here. And so the Sacramento River folks said, let's go down Monterey and check it out. So he sent a guy by the name of Frank Booth who came down to check him out. He said, this is great. Tried to get contracts with Japanese fishermen. They said, oh, well, we got good contracts in markets in San Francisco. So he backs off the little shed right near the Monterey Wharf. In between that time, the city of Monterey leases a piece of property right next to the wharf to a guy named H.R. Robbins. And I've actually seen Mr. Robbins' lease with the city of Monterey. And it says on his lease, for the purposes of sardine cannery, reduction plant, dance hall. He also sold sea lions to the circuses. Needless to say that Mr. Robbins was not the greatest businessman, and Booth bought him out in 1903 and got the contract for Japanese fishery and began to can salmon as his big fishery, and then began to experiment with these large sardines that are appearing in the bay at the end of the salmon season. Just to give you an idea of how large the salmon fishery was, and I talked about it in the film a little bit, but I mean, it was huge. At the end of the 1909 salmon season, and the salmon season lasted 3 months, May 15th to August 15th, the Monterey Daily Cyclist, which was a local newspaper that reported at the end of that salmon season, there were 185 salmon boats fishing the Monterey Bay. 145 of those boats were Japanese owned. And they were catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. The 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds of king salmon in the Monterey Bay. In 1910, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in Monterey Bay. Huge, huge fishery. Well, where was all that salmon going? It wasn't really for the local market. It wasn't even really for the San Francisco market. About 90% of it was going to Europe, mainly to Germany. Germany was a big market at that time. At the turn of the 20th century, people in the United States ate sardines, and they ate a lot of sardines. They ate sardines all over this country. Like today we eat potato chips or crackers, they ate sardines. The sardines they were eating were those little guys, those guys coming from the North Atlantic. Sardine really is kind of a generic word for small silvery fish, right? In California, Monterey, they catch these big guys. They're known as pilchards. So what happens in the world in 1914, World War I? It cuts off all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines coming from Europe, and they just switch and begin to heavily fish sardine along the west coast here. And we're sardine canners in New York State and Maine. Those guys couldn't fish because there were German submarines out there in the Atlantic. So how eventually, sardine fish becomes the largest fishery, single fishery in the United States, mostly fished by Sicilians. Those Sicilian fishermen started coming here after 1905. As I'm sure you all know, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a great deal of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States, coming mainly from white workers who were convinced the Japanese were coming to take their job, which actually really wasn't the case. But in 1905, Mr. Booth says to the local newspaper, not going to hire more Japanese. Easy call for him because he didn't really mean it. He was still going to buy their salmon when they fished salmon in the spring, and he actually employed a number of Japanese workers already working in his cannery. It was that instant he sent for these Sicilian fishermen who already worked for him up along the Sacramento River, fishing salmon, to come down here to Monterey and start fishing sardine as a small secondary fishery, because salmon was king until 1915, when they made that switch and began to heavily fish sardine along the west coast here. But what I should point out in the sardine fishery, at least 20%, any given year of the sardine fishery, at least 15 to 20% of the fishermen fishing sardine were Japanese fishermen. A lot of them were coming from Southern California. I should point out where we are today. This hall, built in 1926 by the Japanese Association, and by the way, this hall has been in the hands of the Japanese since day one, since they built it. Was once a thriving Japan town here, and there was a hotel right across, right where the parking lot is over here, called the Hagashi Hotel, and a lot of those fishermen would stay in that hotel, and they would fish sardine here. So the sardine season in Monterey would go August 1st to February 15th. In Southern California, with another large sardine fishery, would start in October, go all the way into April. And so if you timed it right, you could come all the way up to Monterey and fish all the way into almost into May, if you timed it right to do that. And now a lot of those guys will do that. I think I've taken a lot of time, so I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Lots of interesting history that leading up to the war and the demise of the Japanese fishery in Monterey. But I'd like Sandy to talk about maybe a little broader view of the Japanese, the history and the regional view, I guess you would say.
So you were the national president of the JACL, weren't you? You just weren't the president of JACL, you were the national president of JACL. He prowled the halls of Washington. He was big time, still is. I don't mean to, say that you're not now, but the JACL is one of the most important civil rights organizations in this country. Some would say the most important. Consistently, where you need to be, when you need to be there on the issues. It's obviously not confined to people of Japanese ancestry. My involvement goes back to the 70s, that's 1970s, not the 1870s. Although my wife often says when I say, well, back in the 70s, it's just, wait, which 70s? Because I tend to prowl both this and that. I'm a Hollister boy, and I have to say that. Geoffery and I were talking earlier about our own personal experiences here. Mine were over in a baseball field next to El Estero, where Bobby Mizuka from Gilroy hit a home run off of me into the lake. Forever scarred by that. I've been a teacher for 60 years. 60 years this year. I have no class. You can take that any way you want. I am a classless teacher, but I'm proud to be a teacher in this state, and proud that I've been able to do this and continue to do this. This is a kind of a coming out for me. I've not exposed myself in public very often, and this is a chance. So I think there's two themes I want to hit. One is what happens doesn't happen by chance. Back in 2001, I got a phone call from the county clerk of San Benito County, who was a classmate of mine at the high school, and he said that they were de-accessioning some records from San Benito County, and did I want to help? And I said, well, don't you have a policy for de-accessioning? And he said, no, but we have a dumpster that's backed up to the building, and we want to give you a chance to pick out things that you think ought to be saved. Well, that's not the way you de-accession. San Benito County was a little behind. This is 2001. So historian Carolyn Swift and I raced, literally, over to try to head off the stuff going in the dumpster. And we were in the county building with the records and the stuff. And I'm not making this up, I was standing in the middle of the room and a piece of paper floated from the top shelf. There's no wind in there, and it fluttered down and it landed in front of me, and I picked it up, and it was the resolution passed by the San Benito County Board of Supervisors in April of 1943 that was opposed to the Japanese returning from camp. It came from the sky. Tim's finding the petition was also one of those moments. See, we're being guided. We're being guided. You think that things just happen? Oh, no, we were. And what we did with that resolution, we went back and looked, and each of the 3 counties had passed the resolution with votes of 5-0. This is in 1943 April. The war is going on. And so we thought, in conjunction with the JACL, we got the local chapters organized, we went back to the boards of supervisors in 2002. And we said, excuse me, but you need to rescind this, because you haven't. So fluttering down, and we got 5-0 in all 3 counties. And I want you to think about 2002, because 2002 is kind of a dicey time. So hold that thought, so that we're being guided. And the second theme I want you to, and that's what makes this film so important. We need to model the behavior that we'd like people to have. We need to accentuate the people that have the courage to stand up and say something when it's not very popular. In 2002, this Santa Cruz, Watsonville, the Watsonville, Santa Cruz, always got to do it Watsonville, Santa Cruz in that order. That's a little county history there. The Watsonville, Santa Cruz chapter of the JACL decided to reenact the departure of the Japanese community of Watsonville. So we organized this whole thing, and we actually started organizing in 2001. And as we're getting closer to doing it, now I want you to understand, what we're going to do is we're going to have people of Japanese ancestry walk down Beach Street, just as they did in 1942 April, and get on a bus, and we found one, a 1940s bus. We had it parked down at the bottom of the street, and get on the bus and be taken away. And they actually stopped in the Vets Hall right there where they had to sign in 1942. Beach Street hadn't changed at all, hardly. It looked exactly the same as it did in 1942. So we had that all organized. And then 9/11 comes. And when 9/11 comes, we almost decided not to do this. We're scheduling this for spring, the 60th anniversary of the departure. So we're headed for that. 9/11 comes, we meet, and we say, maybe now is the more important time to do this. Because right after 9/11, anybody that looked like the people who flew the airplanes was under attack all over the country. The nice young man over in Castroville who had the liquor store, who was not from anywhere in the Middle East but looked like it, was being harassed. Everybody that looked anywhere South Asian, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern was under attack. After Pearl Harbor, it was the people who looked like the people flying the airplanes at Pearl Harbor who got taken away. That was the theme then, that we said, no, we got to do this. We have to do this. And then we decided to tell the story that we figured most people knew the story, But who had the courage to stand up? So we began to work some research, and we found in the records, and they weren't easy to find, people who had stood up in 1942-43 as the Japanese community was taken out of the Pajaro Valley and taken away to Arizona. And we found, just as you did in this film, found their descendants, because most of them were deceased, and we honored the people who stood up and said something when it needed to be said. And in my view, besides, we need to talk about what happened, certainly, but we need to start infecting people with the courage. And this last 2 years has been horrific in anti-Asian, anti-everybody stuff going on all throughout the country. That's what the petition, to me, symbolizes. The people that had the courage, and Geoffery and I were saying as the thing was over, that's an incredible piece of film. There is a ton of research and stuff that went on to get some of the visuals in there that I had never seen. It's good. It's good, and I'm hoping that it will become widespread. And most of us still look pretty much like we looked when we were before. Thank God I didn't wear a blue shirt. I'm a little tired of seeing the blue shirt. I'm honored to be in this historic building, and I know you're planning something at the Centennial, yeah? Aren't you?
Yes, of course. It's going to be big. Huge.
Yeah, it'll be big and huge. And he's always the easiest person to find in a crowd. He just is. With that head of hair, oh my God. Larry, thank you for getting involved in this from the beginning. Okay.
Thank you, Sandy. Always a pleasure to have you talk to us. I wanted to add a couple things. In 2018, our local, not our supervisor, but a local supervisor in Monterey County drafted a resolution to apologize to the community for that 1943 resolution. So that was great. Luis. Actually, he was mayor of Watsonville.
Right.
That's probably why. He was a student of Sandy's. But the other point I wanted to bring up is that just last year, there were resolutions that were discovered in Inyo County. Inyo County is where Manzanar Relocation Center is located. And there was a resolution trying to dissuade the Japanese from being released from Manzanar. The resolution was asking the government to deport all of them. So, and those were, of course, counter resolution, rescinding the resolution. So this was just last year. So I wonder how many more there are.
I would guess that there's a strata in 1943 that goes much wider than we know. And it's just going to take, if we live long enough, it's just going to take somebody to go into the records. And it makes it kind of easy because I think they infected, in April of 43, in the spring of 43, because it was already drafted.
Right.
And so it was just something that they could adopt without having to do any work. And obviously, they supported the idea. History, there's always plenty to do. As Kent Seavey and I were commenting earlier, he's one of the local history honchos around here. They just keep churning things, and we have plenty to do. That's we're making it.
Right. Thanks, Sandy. So next we have Geoffery Dunn, the historian from Santa Cruz, who you were in a conversation with our Jeff about baseball, I believe it was. That you prevailed over Monterey, was it?
Hard to believe. Let me see if this will go on. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I grew up in Santa Cruz in the Santa Cruz Italian fishing colony. And I had a great uncle who worked down in Monterey my whole childhood, Monk Laguero. And so I was down here a lot as a kid, and I've always sort of viewed the bay from both sides. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm honored to have participated in this film. I see a lot of friends here. I have to tell you, what you can't see in the film, it's interesting. And Sandy, we've all just experienced seeing ourselves on film, and I was thinking what I was feeling that day. And I had to kind of withhold my anger, because really it was the beginning of the Trump presidency. And it seemed to me that the story that unfolded here in the 1940s was really no different than what was happening today. And quite frankly, the further you pull out in your study of human history, and particularly American history, and I've had to accept this later in life. You mentioned the 1870s and 1970s. Well, I focused my academic career in my youth on the 1770s and the founding of the United States, Declaration of Independence, and the political theories that led to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. And what's interesting, Lincoln made a famous speech in which he talked about the Declaration being the real heart of the American mindset and American politics, and that the Constitution was the silver frame around it. And, you know, I wanted to think that, I guess, in my youth, but I don't think that anymore, and I need to be honest with everyone here today. Watching that film and the story was really shameful. And the fact of the matter is that American democracy is always on the assault, and that there is a constant thread from slavery and the genocide of Native Americans on, of racism in America. And we don't need to go back today. I mean, this country is facing what I would call a great racial divide again. Racism is preeminent. There's talk of the dog whistles that are issued out there, but they're not dog whistles. We all can hear them. And so as I was watching this, I was remember thinking, oh Christ, look what's coming. We've got this assault of Trumpism coming. But what really it is a thread of this country that is always with us. We can walk out 2 blocks and encounter it here right now. I encounter it all the time. And this light that was shed by these people who organized this petition, who signed this petition, is like a ray of hope. It's the only act, you know, it taps into a really beautiful part of this country's history, a noble side. What Lincoln also called the better angels of our nature. And it's a constant struggle. It's not one that just happens every few moments. It has to happen all the time in all of our lives. And, you know, I can't even joke about this stuff anymore. It's so ugly. And the behavior was so ugly. And the activity that took place here and throughout the country was so ugly. And that ugliness doesn't always prevail, but it's always with us. And that racism that is at the root of Trumpism, and I'm sorry, it's at the root of a wide swath of American politics right now. From just what could be heard and said this week about the nomination of Chief Justice and the first African American woman to be named the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The things that were said, and if you go online and look at what's said in these chapters, it is frightening and disgusting. So we're no distant from that right now. Than we were in 1942. We are no distant. It's still present. It's prevalent, and it will take a constant struggle. I wanted to acknowledge Tim. Tim called me and told me about the petitions. I can't remember quite when it was, but it was about 5 to 10 years ago. And he asked me if I could write a piece for the Monterey Herald about the petitions and their discovery and what it meant. And Tim is a dear friend. I love him very much, and I honor all his work he's done here. And I was blown away that he trusted me enough to take the positions with me to Santa Cruz, where I brought them to breakfast with my friend George Al, who was a 1960 graduate of Monterey High. And I brought them to him because I knew he would recognize names on there that I did not. And that I might be able to find someone who had signed the petition. So how many were there? 17? 19?
Yeah, 11.
Yeah. So I handed them to George and we went through them. And he said, Nancy Costello, still alive. I went to Monterey High with one of her daughters. So I want to talk about this story a little bit because seeing Nancy was one of those great things about our community and American history. She signed the petition, she explained to me why, and most importantly, she explained to me the process by which the petitions were drafted and signed, who brought them. It really opened the door to us to that history and how it had happened. And I see that how that's incorporated in so much of what she had to say is incorporated into the film. So I want to acknowledge Nancy for that. It was right before her death, and she was still working on behalf of farm workers the week before she died. And what she told me and showed me was that this is an ongoing struggle. And we still have incarceration camps. Whether you see them as the prison industrial system or urban ghettos or Native American reservations, it's still existing, and it's still a battle, and it's not something that we need to do every 5 years or every 10 years. We need to do it constantly. So that's what I came away feeling today after watching the film.
Thank you, Jeff. I just wanted to mention that is it great uncle Monk Lorero?
My great uncle Monk. Catardo.
So his real first name was Catardo, and they called him Monk because he looked like a monkey as a kid. You know, they didn't worry about that sort of stuff back then. Yes.
Okay. He was a fixture on Fisherman's Wharf.
Yeah.
Well respected by the Japanese, before the war. the Japanese controlled much of Fisherman's Wharf, their processing the fuel docks. But he was one of the people that was always mentioned. Oh yeah, Monk, if we needed anything. I'm not sure if that was, his house was where my father would go, and my dad would come home smelling like garlic.
That was his house. My grandmother, who did a lot, raised me for a variety of reasons, and who didn't speak any English. That was her brother, and there's a famous line about garlic being as good as 10 mothers or 8 mothers, something like that. Well, they were all good mothers to me. But one thing I want to say about my Uncle Monk and my mom's family, we didn't have a lot of Japanese American fishermen in Santa Cruz. But we had a lot of Japanese American family friends who had grown up in Santa Cruz, and they didn't come back after the war, largely. Some did. There was a mention of Tommy Catatani in there, and I saw one of his cards from the incarceration camp in there. And he came back and worked as a gardener, but was never able to own anything after that. Everything had been taken away. I fished with him a lot in my early 20s, 30s. He would never talk about his wartime experience. I've been discovering it. It's been a passion of mine to keep researching what happened to his life. But he was the first person arrested by the FBI in the region. And it was on the front page of the Santa Cruz Sentinel with his picture on it. And I discovered that when looking just in general to what had happened in the region in World War II, and then saw my friend's picture on the cover as being arrested by the FBI. Shocking. So nothing shocks me anymore about America. It doesn't. The violence here is part of our cultural heritage, the racism, the oppression, and the struggle for power and capital. It's just the nature of our beast, and it is ours.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So next we have David Yamada, historian, shortstop, was it? Anyway, you're back in cleanup, so if you...
Okay,
Knock us in.
we're good. Larry, looking at the clock, allocated about an hour for this discussion, and we are at about an hour now, so thank goodness I don't have to say anything.
That clock is
The first thing I want to tell you is I objected to the seating up here because it's my tostada story. But when we have friends over or Jenna comes over, we often have our favorite meal, which is tostada. And when you just slightly warm it up before you sit down to eat, Kathy, my wife, always likes to make sure she gets the right one. So she puts hers on the left, she puts mine on the right, and Jenna generally gets into the center because Kathy believes that reflects our political ideologies. So I objected. I want to trade seats with, as you look visually, with Tim. Okay?
Well, you're on my
Okay, that'll work. So, now, tostadas out of the way. The first thing, Larry asked me to sort of summarize the thoughts, the central ideas, maybe in the documentary film, and the comments of Tim, Sandy, and Jeff. So I jotted down some words that I think capture what I heard and saw. Some of the words include, as I think Jeff specifically alluded, to courage and compassion. Then there was patience and perseverance, which is sometimes expressed by the word gaman. The people in the camps and their lives and what happened during those awful 3 years in camp. Then all of the three panelists spoke about racial discrimination as part endemic in our culture, part of our history. The film, especially the part that caught my attention, were comments by Don Tamaki, the civil rights lawyer, if you remember him. Don Tamaki, so the idea was constitutional protections afforded to all citizens in this country. Then there was it was implicit in the film, and if you weren't sensitive to it, there is a sense of shame, haji. And that shame is probably what in part explained the sound of silence, where parents never spoke to us about what happened. So I'm going to offer just a couple of comments about these parts of the film and what I heard from these three gentlemen. And the first comment I want to focus on deals with the idea of discrimination. Sandy alluded to it rather strongly. Jeff talked about it. And that is part of our history. But I want to tell you a particular story about that kind of discrimination. And it goes back exactly 100 years. So today is 2022. That would take us back to 1922. 1922. A law was passed by the Congress of the United States, and it was called, let me precede that with a couple of comments about part of the story. The birth of a child in the year, it would have to have been, I think it was 1908. The birth of a child by the name, given the name Hinako. And the birth of a child who immigrated from Hiroshima by the name of Gakuro. These two individuals were married by an arrangement of the two families, which was fairly common then. However, the 14th Amendment of our Constitution states very explicitly that if you are born in the country, or if you are naturalized, you are a citizen of the United States. Hinako was born in Los Angeles. Would that not make her a citizen? Gakuro was an immigrant from Japan, but the 1922 Act stated If an American citizen woman marries a Japanese alien immigrant, then the woman loses her U.S. citizenship. 100 years ago, 100 years later, that law was actually rescinded. But I wanted to tell you that the story has meaning to me because Hinako was my mother. And Gakuro, of course, is my father. They, in 1954, took citizenship classes and became naturalized citizens, something about which they were extremely happy, ecstatic, proud. So racial discrimination occurs at the de facto level, and it occurs at the legal level. Laws passed by our highest legislature, the Congress of the United States. The 1922 law, incidentally, was called the Cable, C-A-B-L-E, the Cable Act, if any of you want to follow up and read about it. The second story I'd like to share with you a little bit is about one of the key purposes of this documentary film was and still is to get it into our schools. It's an education tool. And why is that important to all of those who may participate in the film, and particularly to me? I do feel that education is probably one of the two main institutions through which we pass on key core values to our younger generation. Of course, the other key inculcator of values and beliefs is what happens in our homes. It's extremely important that we get this film as soon as we can into our school system, middle schools, high schools, perhaps even some college classes. I took a note down here. I wanted to make sure about the date. It doesn't seem possible, but in this very hall, in September of 2017, a group sat down here and proposed the idea of doing a documentary. 2017, so this is 5-6 years later, we have completed the documentary that you just saw today. Part of my belief is that documents discovered perhaps by fate, by serendipity, by Tim. Documents, I have always believed, are stories waiting to be told. However, you have to find the documents. Some documents are intentionally destroyed and never to see the light of day. The other part of that story, the other side of it, is that someone by the name of Aiko Herzig, Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, who was one of the coordinating, supervising researchers for CRIC, which is an acronym CWRIC, the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. That document was key to the redress movement. Eiko Herzig, working with Peter Irons, a political science professor down at UC San Diego, combined their research to uncover documents that proved that the government of the United States Justice Department deliberately, consciously suppressed documents before a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1943 and 44. That led to the conviction in the three famous wartime cases of Japanese Americans involving Fred Korematsu, Minoru Yasui, and Gordon Hirabayashi of Seattle, Washington. And yet, you saw in the documentary film today, Donald Tamaki, remember him? With that beautiful Japanese garden in the background, that's his home. Donald Tamaki and Dale Minami are third-generation lawyers who led the team in what is called coram nobis. It is a procedure to submit a petition, a writ, to a court system to review an earlier Supreme Court decision. So in 1943, the three convictions for violating curfew or violating evasion of internment in one of the camps, those convictions were reviewed by the team led by Minami and Tamaki. And in 1983, Judge Patel of the U.S. District Court for Northern California vacated the conviction of Fred Korematsu. Documents uncovered, waiting to tell an important story. What could be more important than that? So finally, the one other theme that came through in this documentary, I think, was being just, doing the right thing, bottling it, as Sandy said. Just. And my thoughts always go when we think about the courage to act and right a wrong. My thoughts always go back to a piece in a book called Rebellion, Resistance, and Death by Albert Camus. And there are a few lines I would share with you to think about, hopefully to take away with you, to share with somebody else. Here's what Camus wrote. Nothing is given to man. Nothing is given to man. And the little that he can conquer is paid for with unjust death. But man's greatness lies elsewhere. It lies in his ability to be stronger than his condition. And if his condition is unjust, there is only one way of overcoming it, which is to be just himself, to be just yourself, to act with courage and right the wrong.
So we'll all share. Thank you very much, David. That was a good summary and some extra information too. And for the rest of the panelists, I appreciate the shout out, Sandy. I tried to keep a low profile, but yeah, I know.
Can't help it.
Yeah. My wife says that it's not the hair, it's the big head. So, this was a very important discussion that we had here, and I really appreciate the chapter, really appreciate your participation, all four of you. It's, we're very humbled to have such a distinguished panel to visit us, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and what a distinguished group. Look better today than you did 5 years ago, I'm telling you. None of you did. I need to get a couple personal stories. Two of the best teachers I've ever had, and I wasn't the best student back then, but I realized the greatness of what I was witnessing as a student at MPC, and that was Dr. David Yamada and Dr. Kazarian, two of my most favorite teachers I've ever had. And walking into their classroom, you knew you were in a special place. I remember hearing David's voice back then. I said, man, that guy can really talk. And I'm going to embarrass you, Dr. Kazarian. To this day, one of your lectures was in the lecture forum, and you had the technician come in and say, Dr. Kazarian's not here today, he's not feeling well, but he got a guest speaker to come in and talk to you guys about his experiences coming from Europe. And this old man comes walking across the stage, and we're all sitting in the lecture forum, big old place, where, what the heck, we should all leave. And then, no, we'll listen to this guy, and he starts talking. And then we're all going, hey, that's Dr. Kazarian. And that was, to this day, I can close my eyes and still see you telling that story. And it's one of those things I'll always carry, and I knew what a special teacher, and you're very, very supportive of us in here, and I know you're friends with David here, so thank you for being here today also. And there he was alluding to, I didn't realize Jeff was from the other side of the bay. He was talking about a football game. It was almost 40 years ago. Yeah, it was about 40 years ago. And we lost. A guy kicked a 40-something yard field goal in the mud, and it was just a crazy day. But thanks, Jeff, for bringing that back up. But time flies. And thank you. We will have a reception in back. We have some wine and some cheese and crackers. Please join us. We will have the museum open, and Tim's going to have a last word. But I also, at this time, I want to give a small token of our appreciation to our panelists. Some really nice chocolate, so enjoy that. Tim?
Can I say one thing though? There was one other partner kind of in this petition story, because I've got people ask me a lot, well, where are those petitions today? They're not here. We don't have them on exhibit, but those petitions today live in special collections at Cal State University at Monterey Bay. And I'm very happy to have them there. That's a perfect place for them. And you can go visit them if you'd like to see them. Of course, we have copies of them too. So, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Here comes the omiyage right now.
Monterey